Hey, good morning, Gold Creek. My name is Pablo, and I'm the worship pastor here at Mill Creek. And this is
Vanessa. I'm one of the worship leaders here at Mill Creek.
Yes, and we're excited to be here with you another morning, another reading. And today is February 2nd, day 33. So congratulations. Continue to move strong. Continue to read. It's only going to get better and better. So Vanessa, I have a question for you. What has your experience been like doing this GC 365 plan thus far?
It's been good. It's been challenging for me. I have to be creative, like find ways to fit it in my day. Like sometimes I'll listen in the car, and then sometimes I get to the end of my day and I'm like, oh, I'll do this while I'm making dinner. But like I listen to it, the audio, while I'm doing other things. Helpful. So that helps.
Yeah, that's awesome. At least for me, I know that it's not the easiest thing to do, right? It takes discipline, it takes hard work, but the reward is so incredible. So continue to figure out ways to make sure you're creative in listening or reading it. Some people like to do it in the morning. Some people like to do it at night. Some people like to do it in their cars. Whatever works for you, just make sure you're doing your reading. I think it's going to continue blessing all of us. So today we have the reading starting in Exodus chapter 15, verse 19 through 27. And it starts off with the Lord closing the Red Sea on the Pharaoh and the Egyptians as they're trying to follow Moses and the people of Israel. And I want to start off with what really struck me during this verse. And that is on verse 21, where it says, "And Miriam sang this song, 'Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. He has hurled both horse and rider into the sea.'" Now, I'm a worship pastor, you're a worship leader. I have to start with worship. I think it's our natural response. And we see it here in this verse with Miriam, that her response is, as soon as she sees God triumph and defeat the Egyptians for her, literally fight the fight, literally just the Red Sea opens, right? That's just crazy. And that you've probably already read about that in probably a day or two before. And so their natural response is just to worship. And that's my favorite thing. That's part of what I preach when I'm singing up there, you know, when I'm talking to my team. It's when we worship, it's a response out of what God's done for us. He's done so much for us. There's so many things to be grateful for, that our natural response should be to worship, and to worship out of our experiences with God. Like, what are you experiencing with God right now? What are you going through? What has God done for you? What victories has he given you? What battles has he fought for you? And to me, that just speaks volumes. And that's why I worship. That's why I encourage other people to worship. What about you? Anything that struck you out of these verses at all?
Well, you said that so well. I mean, I just have to agree that when I'm so overwhelmed with God's goodness, I can't help but worship. And so I could really relate to that too. Like, they're just so thankful and they've seen this amazing miracle, and then they just pour out praise. So
yeah, that's so good.
Yeah.
Let's continue here. I also see that in verse 22 through 27, those are great reminders that their journey from Egypt to the promised land wasn't going to be problem-free, but God was going to be with them and help them through it all. And I think, to me, that's especially important, because when we are followers of Christ, it doesn't mean that, you know, we don't have any problems, as you probably already know. It almost feels like when we choose to follow Christ and we're intentional about it and we're trying our best to just do the right thing and just be righteous before God's eyes, it's just, I feel like, you know, things just start to pile up, problem after problem. But what we see here in this verse, as, you know, they're trying to find water to drink, and they come across this water that's bitter. And then God just opens the door, like, last minute. He's always there in the clutch. We have a clutch God. He always comes in the clutch, which I love about him. And it's so important to realize that our problems don't go away when we're following Christ. All that means is that now we have someone to walk through those problems, through that storm with, and God provides a way. And like he did for Moses and the Israel people, is that he turned, you know, bitter water into drinkable water. So I thought that was awesome. Moving on to Exodus 16, I think is also a very interesting story where Moses and the people are wandering in Israel, and they're struggling to forget Egypt, where God brought them out from, and they start complaining to Moses. They start just being angry because they start remembering if they had all this food back then and what that looked like, and they're starving in the middle of the desert. And what does God do? He gives them manna and quail from heaven. And I think that's just, that in itself is so amazing. To me, it's actually shocking of how God has brought them out of Egypt, with a mighty hand, and they still are like doubting God. Like, why did he bring us out here to this desert? Like, if I saw the Red Sea split in two and you cross it dry land, that is to me like, wow, this is incredible. Like, God, I'm trusting you 100% here from here on out. But they still find themselves in difficult situations and having a hard time trusting and believing God and why he brought them out of Egypt, out of slavery and all these things. But yet God still comes in and he says, you know what? I'm going to give you guys manna and quail from heaven. Like, what would you do if you just look out your window right now and it's just raining quail and raining manna, like heavenly bread, right? That's pretty much what that is. Yeah. It's like, you would be like, whoa, this is weird. And they also thought it was extremely weird, but that's how they were eating. And so that's another example of how God just has been faithful and leading them through this whole journey from Egypt to the promised land. But let's move on to Matthew chapter 22. Vanessa, so what stood out to you in these verses? Anything in particular that God was speaking to you?
Yeah. So the thing that I just kept coming back to is that we always have to be prepared at any time. And I, myself included, I tend to think of sometimes God far away or heaven far away, and really it could be at any moment. And so sometimes when I read a verse like this, it's a reality check for me, like, wow, okay, am I prepared? Am I ready? Where is my heart? And it's this, like the Bible oftentimes is a mirror, a reflection of your heart. And it's an opportunity to really like check yourself and be like, okay, I need to be better prepared, or these are areas where I need to align my heart better.
Yeah, no, that's great. For this verse also, what I took from it is, well, first off, you have to know, if you don't know by now, a parable is a simple story that illustrates a moral or spiritual lesson, right? And all throughout the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we see Jesus speaking to the people in parables and these stories to try to explain a deeper meaning to something, right? Mm-hmm. And so as we're talking about the parable of the great wedding feast and how he gets into it, I think it's a great story illustrating how God's chosen people was Israel. But Israel kept turning their back on him, and as we read in these verses, he's sending out his servants to go and invite all these people to this great banquet, this great feast that's happening, but nobody wants to. People are saying, "Oh, I got to do this. Oh, I have this to do. I can't." And so at the end of the day, he gets fed up, right? And he says, "All right, invite anyone who wants to come." And that's something that should be extremely exciting for all of us, because we're that other ones, right? We're the just person walking down the street, just minding our business, and yet we get invited. And what that means for us is that we are now called children of God. We get the privilege to be called children of God, to have that relationship with God. And that's something that I'm extremely grateful for. As it says in verse 10 of Matthew 22, it says, "So the servants brought in everyone they could find, good and bad alike, and the banquet hall was filled with guests." And I love that. It says good and bad alike. It wasn't because we were righteous. It wasn't because we deserved it. It's because we have a good God, that he's merciful, that he's full of grace, and that he loved us even in spite of us, right? So that really was awesome, and I'm just so grateful for that. And just a little side note, I as I was studying for this, I read in John chapter 1, verse 12 to 13, and this will probably be a reading down somewhere in the future, right? But it said, "He came to his own people, and even they rejected him. But to all who believed in him and accepted him, he gave the right to become children of God." And that's us. So that's something to be extremely thankful and excited for. So let's move on now to Psalms chapter 27. I think the main thing that stood out to me is verse 4. I love this verse because it shows how much David loved the Lord. And what is saying here is essentially that he wants to be in God's presence all the days of his life, right?
Mhm.
And so we read this verse here. Let me just pull it up. And it's right here. So it says, the one thing I ask of the Lord, the thing I seek most, is to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, delighting in the Lord's perfections and meditating in his temple. So if God asks you, what's the one thing you want most in life right now? What would it be? I don't know if your answer would be similar to David's here, but I think it's absolutely important to understand that there is nothing better than being in God's presence.
Mm-mm.
And I mean, we're talking about King David, where he had everything.
Yeah.
He also at one point lost everything, right? But he's experienced everything. One of the greatest kings in the Bible. He'll be remembered for all time. And out of all that, the one thing that he desires most, the one thing that he seeks most is God's presence. And I love that. I love that. One thing that I also like to say continually to our team and to the church is it's to be aware that when we worship, it's not to try to enter God's presence. As children of God, God's presence is already with us, and we're in his presence at all times.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just being aware of his presence at all times with us. And that's something that I think is absolutely important. And if all of us thought that way, that wherever we go, we're in God's presence, it's not just on a Sunday morning when we meet at church and we're singing songs, I think that would change the way we think a little bit, the way we walk, the way we did things, the way our attitude and things like that, when we understand that God's presence is with us at all time. Did anything stand out to you in these verses?
Well, I always relate to the Psalms as a musician and as a deep thinker, and I love how David thinks, and the Psalms are so beautiful. So I like what you're talking about, being in God's presence continually. I've talked about this a lot with my husband and with when I went and spoke recently in the middle school and spoke about this, that in the presence of God is where transformation happens. So when you're talking about if we lived that way, our lives would be a lot different. If you're living your life like you're in the presence of God and you're continually in that, there's such power and transformation in that. It's just insane. And so it's one thing to recognize that. It's another thing to live it.
Yeah, that's good.
And so I am constantly trying to remind myself and be in God's presence and realign in God's presence, because there's power.
Absolutely. I love what you said with the transformation thing, because like you said, when we are in God's presence, he transforms our thinking. He transforms the way we act, the way we do things. And just imagine if we all lived like that throughout the day. From the morning we woke up and said, God, thank you for your presence. Thank you for being with me. All throughout the day, little reminders that God's with us, to the moment we lay our heads in bed and to go to sleep and we think, God, thank you for your presence. I mean, he's with us at all times. And I love how he continues in verse 6, in the second half of that verse, and it says, At his sanctuary, I will offer sacrifices with shouts of joy, singing and praising the Lord with music. And then here's where we kind of come to, what we understand as our Sunday morning gatherings. Like when we come together, we come to offer sacrifices of worship and of praise to God with shouts of joy, with singing and praising the Lord with music. And that's why it's extremely important for us to gather, whether, it's online or if you come to our drive-in services or if you come inside the building. It's important that we continually do that and understand the importance of worshiping God with our voices, with singing, with music, and so on. So yeah, I love those verses. Let's move on to the next verse in Proverbs chapter 6, verse 20 through 26. What did you take away from those verses?
So Proverbs for me, it's one of the, obviously Solomon was extremely wise. He wrote a lot of the Proverbs. I feel like Proverbs, again, I'm saying this word a lot today, helps me realign. And so when I need to get my mind right, I'm in Proverbs, and this is no exception. And I found something that that even more so, like the promises in Proverbs and the wisdom in Proverbs, that now I'm praying them over my kids, and that I'm wanting that for my kids as well. And so, that was something you said that sparked that thought in me. And I was just thinking, boy, I used to read these and think, okay, I want this for my life. And now I'm thinking, I want this for my children, and I'm praying this wisdom over them. And so it's cool to see them in a dual perspective like that for myself, and then as well for my kids. So
yeah, that's awesome. And I'll finish it with this. And kind of what you just said is, I remember my dad, since I was young, since as long as I can remember, he's been reciting these verses to me and to my brother. And I mean, growing up, when you're 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, or you think about it and you're just like, Dad, I know you read this to me all the time. You want me to be a good kid. You want me to listen to what you're telling me. I get it. But I would say that I turned out okay. I'm not like a perfect righteous person, but I think I turned out okay. And I credit that a lot to my dad reading this to us as kids and instilling it in our hearts, and understanding that there's a blessing in obeying our parents and doing what's right, and everything that these Proverbs talk about. And it's exactly right what you said. And so now I want to do the same thing with my son, with my daughter, with my kids. And I pray to God that, I can instill that the word of God in their hearts, for them to grow up to serve God and to be good people that follow Jesus. Mm-hmm. So, hey, I think that's all we have for today. Thank you guys for joining us. We're so excited for you to continue this journey with us. Don't give up. Keep fighting the good fight. Keep reading God's word or listening to it. The point is, don't stop. We love you guys. Take care.